Welcome to the Excruciating Minutiae Podcast, where we obsess about sports, pop culture, and politics, but mostly sports. Here are your hosts, Randy and Steven.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Excruciating Minutia. I'm Randy, and I'll be joined by Steven today. And today's topic, we're going to be talking about the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame elections, which were made official today for your 2019 class. We had already talked about guys we thought were going to get in. Today, we're going to talk about those guys. We're going to talk about the ones who came close, and we're going to talk about some very strange things that we saw on the ballot and things that didn't make us particularly happy. But the first thing we're going to focus on, Steven, is, my God, we finally got a prediction right. Holy, yeah, I'm stunned that we called it. We thought it would be Rivera, Martinez, Halladay, and Messina is what looked like it would be, and that's who it was.
They say that every once in a while a blind squirrel finds a nut, or the other one is a broken clock is right twice a day. We are the broken clock, and we have finally made correct picks.
I'm not complaining.
I'm proud. Yeah, I'm proud of ours. You know, we should pat ourselves on the back because, God, we needed to win bad.
We did. We have not been very particularly on target when it comes to nailing any sort of prediction since we've begun these podcasts. So it's nice to finally kind of get something right, even if we, as you put it earlier, had a little bit of a cheat sheet with the public ballots kind of showing what was trending and what wasn't trending. But I don't care. I'm taking a victory. You can't take it. It's a victory on the scorecard, damn it. I'm taking it. I'm taking it.
As the wife of one of our friends once said, I thought you guys knew what you were doing.
This is true. This case, we knew what we were doing. And you know who else knew what they were doing? The people who voted for Mariano Rivera on the first ballot, as he becomes the very first player, amazingly enough, to be elected unanimously. It's taken a number of years and a lot of great players who weren't elected unanimously, but Mariano has broken through the glass ceiling, so to speak, and 425 ballots, and he was on every single one of them. And not a surprise, he would have been on our ballots, that's for certain.
He would have. I think what's happened is finally all the old curmudgeons who were just refused to vote for a guy on the first year have finally retired, died off, whatever it is. I heard some interesting things as I was watching the MLB Network when they were announcing, and they were talking about, it was just prior to, and they were saying, you know, Rivera might be the first guy. And they mentioned players in the past. I mean, 35 ballots did not include Mickey Mantle on his first year of eligibility. Mickey freaking Mantle. But Babe Ruth was not unanimous, not even close. The closest we'd had up until now, I believe, was Griffey a few years ago, who was only 3 ballots short of unanimous.
That was the highest percentage. He got 99.3%, and you're correct. Only 3 people left him off the ballot in 2016. So you're absolutely dead on correct on that one.
So that was kind of interesting. You know, Halladay and Edgar Martinez got in pretty comfortably at about 8, both with the exact same number of votes, 85.4%, 363 out of the 425 ballots. And Mike Messina was the guy who kind of squeaked in. He needed 319 ballots. He got 326. So there will be a large Yankee contingent at Cooperstown this coming summer. A town of 1,800 people is probably going to be inundated with about 40 to 50,000 fans.
The vote totals that you're mentioning there, I think we talked about it when we saw what the public ballots were trending towards before this, that we were both maybe a little surprised that Halladay's numbers were that high. When you look at his lifetime numbers and you look at his career, I thought he was a Hall of Famer. So did you. But there were certainly numbers that traditionally weigh heavily in the minds of Hall of Fame voters, like victories, where he was lower than totals that we've seen in years past. In fact, I saw a stat that said he had the lowest number of victories for any Hall of Fame pitcher that was elected since like Allie Joss or something like that, who was elected, I believe, probably by the Veterans Committee. But it was, Addie Joss was elected in 1978 by the Veterans Committee with 160 wins. So this is the fewest by a starting pitcher since then. And that's not a general election with the voters, who have traditionally looked at wins as a major component of a pitcher's resume. I'm a little surprised he got in. Like I said, I would have voted for him. You would have voted for him. But to see him get the 85%, he didn't squeak in. And he finished almost 9% ahead of Messina, who did squeak in, who had far more victories. Messina was the tail, much like Edgar was, of the starting slow and then gradually gaining support over your time on the ballot until you finally got in. And again, I said before in one of our previous podcasts when we talked about our Hall of Fame votes, at least who we thought were going to get elected, that I would have voted for Messina, but I'd kind of come around to that. And that's what it looks like happened. He started, I believe, in the 20% range when he first hit the ballot. And just over time, there's been more of an acceptance about how consistent he was over such a long period of time and just how good he was in a steroid hitter's era. And Edgar Martinez, I think we saw the same kind of acceptance of the DH as a viable candidate and not to have that held against him because he was such a good hitter. And of course, we talked on the last podcast, Harold Baines' election probably didn't hurt either for people who were casting ballots.
The interesting thing about that is I was actually watching MLB Network a lot today, and there were a number of baseball writers on there, and they said that they had talked to their peers, and none of their peers paid any attention to what the Veterans Committee does. They just don't. They don't look at that and say, oh, well, if he got in, now maybe some of the writers do, but these are the guys we all know, right? Tim Kirkjians, the Jason Starks of the world, the Peter Gammons, etc. To talk a little bit about the players, things that I saw that were kind of interesting that we had missed when we talked about it the other day. Edgar Martinez really didn't become a full-time player until he was 27 years old. And somehow figured out a way to pack enough good years in there to make a Hall of Fame career. Halladay, the one thing that they mentioned about Halladay was that he had a very low win total, but what he was is he was a workhorse. He had, in his peak from 2003 to 2011, he threw 61 complete games, which was more than double the next closest player,
who was CC Sabathia, who was also
Correct.
known as a workhorse. I remember owning Roy Halladay from a fantasy baseball perspective and loving it because we were playing, of course, in a league, the same one we do now, where innings pitched at the time was a category, and Halladay was just a monster. He would go out every single night and go deep into games. And it was remarkable. Like you said, he was very much unlike any pitcher of his era. And as they've referred to him, one of the last great workhorses is in the ESPN article.
Yep.
And he truly was. You don't see that type of pitcher anymore and those type of innings pitch totals. And the win total is low, but the overall winning percentage is very high. We talked about that. And he has a lot of good points on his resume. The 2 Cy Young awards, 1 in each league, 2 second place finishes. He had the perfect game. He threw the no-hitter in the playoffs. There's just so much. He won 20 games multiple times. That's another stat traditionally Hall of Fame voters have looked at, whereas how many times you won 20, which pitchers just don't tend to do anymore. But Halladay still managed to have multiple 20-win seasons. And just we talked about it. He was just arguably the most dominant, best pitcher in baseball during his prime, or at least if he wasn't the best, he was in the conversation of the best. So I'm just glad to see that he got that recognition. I honestly thought he was not going to get in this first ballot. Originally, when I knew he was going to be on the ballot, I kept thinking, well, he's going to start in that 50% range. 40 to 50%, and he's going to have to gain momentum. And the ballot is still somewhat crowded. There's a lot of big names on this ballot, but he made it in his first time. And the sad thing is he's not here to actually enjoy it, though his family obviously will be there, and along with all those Yankee fans at Cooperstown.
Has any other pitcher thrown 2 no-hitters in a season? I mean, he threw a no-hitter and a perfect game in the same season.
Well, Vandermeer threw the back-to-back. I'm pretty sure it's been done by other pitchers. We'd have to look that up, and that's something we could always come back to at a later time. He just was a great pitcher. And you mentioned again with Edgar Martinez, stayed his entire career with Seattle. Very much one of their guys on the Seattle Mount Rushmore, if you will, along with Ken Griffey and Randy Johnson. Obviously, he was a great hitter, just a hitting machine. 2 batting titles and hit 312, I believe, lifetime was his total. And the DH thing, some people held that against him, I believe, on previous ballots. But at some point, just his excellence at the plate overcame that sort of stigma that the DH has. And that may open the door in the future for other players who may or may not be players with significant time at the DH position that will be coming up on ballots. That certainly doesn't hurt for him getting in. And of course, Rivera, the best reliever of all time by many accounts. Many people view him as the best closer of all time. And if you don't, it'd be hard to not say he's in your top 2 or top 3. I'm not really sure. Maybe there are people that would put Hoffman in front of him, but I wouldn't. And to see 100% guy, you mentioned that no one had made it at 100%, that Griffey had been the closest. Now, to be fair, there are some extenuating circumstances. There was a period of time where the ballot was extremely stuffed back in I believe it was like in the 1950s, where there just were so many names on the ballot and the voters were just not voting guys in, and people were crowding each other out. That had a little bit something to do with it. More egregious were later year votes, because, who didn't vote for Willie Mays for the Hall of Fame? Somebody didn't, because he wasn't unanimous, right? Who didn't vote for Hank Aaron for the Hall of Fame? Another guy. How could you not vote for him? The ones who didn't vote for Griffey, how do you not vote for him? There was always, as you said, the curmudgeons. There were people who said, I'm never voting for somebody on the first ballot. Well, that's ridiculous. A person should be a Hall of Famer or he's not. You can come up with a lot of reasons to vote for someone and a lot of reasons to not vote for them. And we're going to talk about some of those, but I just don't want to put someone on the first ballot is not a legitimate reason. And you shouldn't have a ballot if you're thinking that way. So some of those people apparently are gone if he got to 100%.
And I think some of that is, once like the absolute greats of the sport weren't unanimous, like the Willie Mays, the Hank Aaron's, going back to Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and guys that weren't unanimous. Because that happened, they basically used that to legitimize their not doing it.
Using previous results to legitimize a bad decision-making process is, again, something that we'll be getting to a little bit later. But before we do, these are the 4 guys. We talked about them at length in our previous podcast on the Hall of Fame elections. So I don't think there's really much more we can say other than, hey, we would have voted for these guys. They're in and they deserved it. It's now time to talk about people who almost made it or who were in that vicinity and perhaps other guys we would have voted for. So, Stephen, if you had a vote, we already had talked about you voting for these 4. Who else on this ballot would have gotten your vote?
I would have voted for Curt Schilling. His regular season stats are kind of borderline, but what really pushes him over the edge is what he did in the postseason. Both with, he pitched for Philadelphia in the postseason, right? Wasn't he on that 93 team? He pitched in the postseason for Arizona. He pitched for the Red Sox.
Yeah, that Red Sox postseason performance.
Wow, the bloody sock.
Kind of noteworthy.
So, based off of that, he probably deserves to get in. I would have voted for him. I also would have voted for Larry Walker. He's the type of guy to me that, yes, did he play a majority of his career in Coors Field? Sure. But he was good when he was in Montreal. I mean, he was really good when he was in Montreal. And I don't think it really would have mattered so much where he was. He was a really good player in Montreal before he got to Colorado. He did have the one MVP season. He led the majors in home runs. He led the majors in batting average 3 times, on base percentage twice, slugging percentage twice, OPS twice. He was Gold Glove a number of years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And he finished with 383 home runs, 1,311 RBIs, 1,355 in runs, 313 batting average. He had 230 steals. I mean, in his prime, he was, he had a couple of years where he was right around or above 30 steals. Just a really solid all-around ball player, and I would have definitely voted for him.
So that's your only is that your only other two you would have added to the list of guys who you would have? Is that it?
That is probably it. Yeah, that's it. I would have voted for 6 guys. That's it. No one else to me felt like a Hall of Famer.
Your list seems very similar again to mine. And the first person I'll talk about is Schilling. And Curt Schilling, I absolutely would have voted for. And you talked about Edgar Martinez kind of not really getting a full-time job until he was 27, and the fact he forged a Hall of Fame career. What if I told you that Curt Schilling, going into his age 30 season, which, by the way, was 1997, so again, in the middle of an offensive boom in the major leagues, that Schilling had a 3.49 career ERA, but he had only started slightly over half of the games he'd appeared in, that he was 52-52 at that point in his career and had bounced around to 3 different teams, actually 4, because I'm not sure if you remember this. As a Red Sox fan, perhaps you do. He was originally drafted by the Red Sox and traded by them with Brady Anderson for Mike Boddicker, which in retrospect, you're like, wow, that's a terrible trade. But I do believe Mike Boddicker helped push. That was a midseason trade. I believe Boddicker helped the 88 Red Sox to winning the division that year. It's easy to look back in hindsight and say it's a terrible trade, but it's what it was. It was a contender with a non-contender acquiring somebody for the stretch run, and Schilling went in that deal. Then he was traded. He was involved in a couple decent trades here. He was traded by Baltimore then a couple years later to Houston, along with Steve Finley and Pete Harnisch for Glenn Davis, who was a complete disaster in Baltimore. So that's a trade the Orioles certainly would have liked to have back. And then Houston, he was traded to Philadelphia for Jason Grimsley. So he had been moved around quite a bit over his career, and actually had become a free agent in 95 and had re-signed with the Phillies. So Curt Schilling, 52-52 from 1988 to 1996. So he entered his age 30 season at that point. From that point on, from 96 to the end of his career, that would have been 2007, Schilling went 173 and 104. A 3.43 ERA over that period of time, again, in the middle of some heavy offensive seasons. He had won 16 games for the 93 Phillies. He went 16-7. He was 14-11 in 1992. Those were the only 2 seasons he had double-digit wins at that point before he turned. Well, actually, I'm counting 96 in this. I actually wanted to look just from 97 on. From 1997 to the end of his career, Schilling went 164-94. That's the number I wanted. A 3.45 ERA. So I mentioned these previous seasons before he turned age 30, he had only 2 double-digit winning seasons. After that, he won 20 games 3 times, led the league twice, 22 with Arizona in 2001, 21 with the Red Sox in 2004, 23 in 2002 with Arizona, which did not lead the league. He won 17 games, 15 games 3 times. He was just completely dominant from that point on and led the league in innings. Again, another workhorse. He had a couple big inning seasons, and he had a couple really big strikeout seasons. 2 seasons he led the league with over 300 strikeouts, 398, 319, and 97. The only black mark, if you would say, about that part of his career was to no fault of his own, is that he didn't win a Cy Young, but in some of these cases he was losing to Randy Johnson. who was on his team as his teammate on those Arizona teams. But he had 2 top 10 MVP finishes, 4 top 15 MVP finishes in that period, and 4 top 5 Cy Young appearances, 3 times coming up runner-up. He was a dominant pitcher during that stretch. Like you said, the overall numbers, his comparison I kept thinking was Halliday's, in that they both had some monster seasons. Their peak maybe was not as lengthy as Messina's, because we talked about whether or not players should get more credit for consistency over brilliance, and what weighs more, or should one weigh more than the other. Schilling was certainly more of the star shone brightly for a shorter period of time and then burned out. His win total was higher than Halliday's. He won 216 games. He had a great ERA. He struck out over 3,000 guys. That still counts for something, I think. And of course, as you pointed out, he has the iconic moment in postseason history. And again, you as a Red Sox fan, the bloody sock game is forever going to be remembered as a testament to his willingness to do whatever it took to go out there and win, his grittiness, his toughness. And he was such a leader on that Red Sox team that broke the long-standing curse. And his arrival in Boston signaled that the Red Sox were going to be a different team with him, and that they were going to be a team to be reckoned with, and that this was going to be the team that was going to finally get over the hump and bring a World Series to Boston after so many years. And he did, with all the weight of that on his shoulders. And a lot of that was on his shoulders. He delivered, and he delivered on the biggest stage imaginable at the time in the postseason in that game against the Yankees. So he's a Hall of Famer. He didn't get, where did he end up on the votes here? He ended up at little over 60%. So he went up from last year, correct? Because he was, what was the percentage he increased?
He was at 51.2% last year.
So that's a significant increase. He got almost 10% more. So that's he's trending in the right direction. He's kind of following the Edgar Martinez / Messina path to get there. We talked about it off the podcast before, that one thing that might be hurting him might be, political affiliations. And we're not going to debate those political affiliations here, because frankly, it doesn't matter what his politics are. I think we talked about it, that there would be a level of unpopular thinking that you could have that would absolutely disqualify you from getting voted to a Hall of Fame. If you came out and you said, you know what, that Charles Manson guy had it right. I don't know why everyone had a problem with him. Yeah, you know what? That's probably going to get you off a lot of people's Hall of Fame ballots, right? I really have no issue with what happened at Jamestown back in the late 70s. These are the type of things that would probably get you disqualified. But at the end of the day, we're not talking about Schilling's political beliefs. We're not talking about his stance on the spectrum of the political spectrum, because this is about his performance on the field, and nothing he did off the field. And again, this is going to tie in a little bit with some of what we're going to talk about with other guys who missed. Nothing he did off the field should count against him getting into the Hall of Fame, though it may be affecting some of his votes. But if that's the case, that trend may be turning, because again, he gained close to 10%. So he is trending in the right direction. And something else we talked about is the ballot's going to be thinning over the next couple years of good candidates, which will only help him at that point. And the only thing I'll say about Larry Walker briefly is I'm not sure if I would have voted for him, but I think every argument you made, everything you said about Larry Walker, he was not just a pure Coors Field manufactured product. He was a very, very good player in Montreal before he ever got to Coors Field. His numbers accelerated, obviously, at Coors Field. Everyone's did. But, he was certainly a very talented hitter, and he was entering his prime. And no matter where he would have played, he would have, I think, put up solid numbers. And his overall numbers were outstanding. And I have no issue with him being elected to the Hall of Fame. I'm not sure I would have given him a vote, but I feel like he might have been one of those guys that I would have come around to, a la Messina, and just looked at him and compared him to other guys of his era and made that determination. You know what? This guy is a Hall of Famer. And there's some just ridiculous numbers. I mean, you looked at what he did in Colorado and, multiple batting titles, but boy, we're not talking about winning it hitting 302. I mean, he hit 379 and 99, I believe, 363, 366, 350. He had OPSs over 1,000 in 7 different seasons. That's ridiculous. A 965 career OPS. That's kind of the number that stands out to me. A 400 lifetime on base percentage. Lots of doubles, lots of homers, 230 steals. He won Gold Gloves. He was a good fielder, a great fielder.
He had one of the all-time great arms in right field. No one ran on him.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think I'm not sure if I would have put him on my ballot. If you put a gun to my head, I can't say 100% for sure, but I have absolutely no issue with anybody who put him on the ballot. And if he makes the Hall of Fame, there will be no cheapening of it by putting him in there. He's a very talented player who put up a great career and certainly would be worthy of induction. And he's headed maybe towards that.
He went up 20 points this year. He was at 34% vote total last year. He's at 54 now. That's a pretty fast acceleration. That was one of the things I noticed on the spreadsheet, is that he had the most added votes of the known votes of any player.
The question will be that this will be his final year on the ballot next season.
Correct.
Can he get a similar jump? Players have tended to not do that. I think traditionally, if you look back, that you'll see players when they hit a certain percentage, if they're not at a certain place at a certain time, they just don't get in. Walker certainly would have benefited by the old 15 years on the ballot that it used to be. And then I would say, I think he's definitely going to make it in. I don't know if he's going to get enough of a jump, but the fact that the ballot cleared out and that there were so many, if Halladay had not been elected, his coming back may have hurt him. But the fact that Halladay is off the ballot, Rivera obviously off the ballot, the fact that Edgar Martinez was coming off the ballot either way, Messina, these are guys that were taking votes, and you only get so many guys you can vote for. A thinner ballot will certainly help Walker, and he may be the most attractive candidate, the least controversial candidate potentially, with the best numbers going into next season, and that alone may be enough to push him over the top. So,
well, Derek Jeter's on next year's ballot, so that's another.
That's true.
That's something I'll have to battle with.
Another potential 100%er, maybe, but we'll have to wait and see.
I'm not sure about that. A couple more things about those two. Larry Walker, when you're looking at Hall of Fame, he has 24 black inks. Average Hall of Famer has 27. Again, that's on Baseball Reference. And his career wins above replacement is literally what the average is at his position for Hall of Famers. 72.7 career wins above replacement, which is exactly what the average Hall of Fame right fielder is. 72.7 career WAR. His similarity scores, some of the guys on his similarity scores are Hall of Famers, some of them aren't. The guys that are: Duke Snider, Joe DiMaggio, Vladimir Guerrero, all in are similar batters to him. So going to Schilling, talking about those same types of things. Black ink, he has 42. Average Hall of Famer is about 40. His wins above replacement is 79.6. The average for a starting pitcher is 73.4. Average Hall of Fame starting pitcher, let me make that clear, 73.4. He has a lot of gray ink too. He has 205 score in the gray ink. Average Hall of Famer 185. The thing that's a little weird about him is his similarity scores. There's a lot of pitchers here who aren't Hall of Famers, but some of them are. So Kevin Brown, Bob Welsh, Tim Hudson, Oral Hershiser, but also on this list is John Smoltz and Justin Verlander, who kind of is, doesn't Justin Verlander feel like he could potentially be a Hall of Famer if he continues on his same, path that he's on.
Yeah, at this point, he's a Hall of Famer simply for landing Kate Upton. At this point, I'd give him a vote for that. I mean,
yeah,
that to me deserves special kudos right there. So
he's been Rookie of the Year. He has a Cy Young and an MVP. He's finished second in the Cy Young 3 times, third once. He's kind of had a rebirth in Houston after having a couple of kind of questionable years. He had one really questionable year in Detroit. I think I may have owned him that year. It seems familiar. But he has a lot of black ink, led the league in wins a number of times. So he has that feel that, but like you said, he should get that Kate Upton bump.
Actually, there's multiple bumps there on Kate Upton that he's getting a boost from. Well, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Hello.
Is that wrong?
Hello. Let's keep in mind that most of the voters are male, so that definitely helps the
take that into consideration.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the 2 guys that kind of missed. One of them is a little bit controversial. Larry Walker's not really a controversial guy. But we'll get into the next group of guys who didn't get in, and there is definitely some level of controversy about them.
We have 2 different groups here, and I think we're both going to take 2 different paths to this. We have people that are getting votes and are part of a classification. I guess we can just call them the steroid guys. And then we have other guys who are not really exactly sure why they got votes. And I'm a little aggravated because of something I saw last night. It was the first time I saw it. I'm more than a little aggravated, Stephen. When I read this, I was infuriated by some of the ridiculous lack of logic, no consistency or hypocrisy, or in some cases, just absolute stupidity. And stunningly enough, coming from guys who work for ESPN. I know you're shocked that ESPN might not be practicing some of the best journalism, but I'm pretty ticked.
I got a lot of problems with you people. Now you're going to hear about it.
Yes, they're going to hear about them. So I'm going to start first, and I'm going to go over the guys, some of these steroid guys, and you can chime in how you feel about this, but I just want to get this out of the way first. So there's an article on ESPN that popped up. It was maybe sometime yesterday where ESPN writers made known what their ballots were. And these are problems I had with them. And there's some people on here I absolutely respect and think a lot of and think are very knowledgeable. I just think that they were wrong in certain of these instances. And I'm going to go through some of these votes and some of the controversial things I found in these votes. First off, we'll start with Keith Law. Keith Law is a very intelligent person and knows a lot about the game of baseball. I'm going to use their exact words. So this is exactly what they said. He left off Manny Ramirez off his ballot. He included Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds, however. And Law said this. He said, "My last spot came down primarily to 3 names, Sheffield, Manny Ramirez, and Todd Helton. Ramirez had the highest pure wins above replacement total, but unlike every player on my ballot, actually tested positive twice, once for a masking agent and once for testosterone." So Law basically came out and said, I'm not voting for Manny Ramirez, despite all these tremendous numbers, because he failed the test. Stephen, you're a huge, huge cycling fan, correct?
I am.
Competitive cycling.
Yes.
Okay. How many Tour de France's did Lance Armstrong win? Not officially, but how many did you watch him win?
7.
How many times did Lance Armstrong test positive or fail a doping test or a drug test?
Officially, none.
Exactly. Did Lance Armstrong cheat? Did he dope?
He admitted it.
He even admitted it.
Yes, he did.
But wow, he didn't fail the test. So my question for Keith Law is, you know your numbers, but you have to be very naive about beating a test. We've talked about it before. The drug makers, the steroid makers, the blood dopers in cycling or in track and field is another sport that's seen a lot of issues with performance enhancing problems. They're well ahead of the curve when it comes to the people testing to try to catch them. And you're hopelessly naive if you think that a failed test is the only way that you're going to be able to know whether or not somebody did drugs or not. all of the evidence that came out against Armstrong, but 0 tests. If that isn't proof right there that you can't just say, well, he didn't fail a test, so clearly he didn't use it. I have a huge problem with law using that as his litmus test for why he's putting Bonds and Clemens in, but he's not putting Manny Ramirez in. And he even says Manny has this ridiculous wins above replacement total. And you were talking about comps. Guys that Manny Ramirez is comp to are names like Jimmy Fox, Ted Williams, Ken Griffey Jr., Mickey Mantle, Frank Thomas, Chipper Jones, Jim Tomei. What do all these guys have in common? They're all in the Hall of Fame. They're all, and the only 2 players who are the only 3 players that are on his comp list on Baseball Reference that are not in the Hall of Fame are Miguel Cabrera, who's still active, David Ortiz, who isn't eligible yet, and Gary Sheffield, who did not fail a test. But I think I pointed out earlier, I have a problem voting for a guy who willingly admitted that he tanked plays to get himself traded out of Milwaukee. And that's inexcusable to me. And I it'd be better if he came across at any point in time and said, you know what, I was young, I was stupid, I never should have done that. In retrospect, it was a stupid thing to do. I'm not sure he ever did. If he did, I take that back, and I would say kudos for him for admitting immaturity at a young age. I'm not really sure he did. But statistically, Manny was a better player than Sheffield, who also, by the way, there were steroid clouds that surrounded him a little bit as well, as you could say about so many hitters. But like I said, Keith Law, I really can't understand how you can say, well, I'm using the positive test when the testing just doesn't work.
Let me add one piece to that. So one of the easiest things in the world to do is to beat a drug test, but it's super easy to beat a drug test when you know you're only getting tested once a year. And so these players all knew they were getting tested once during spring training. And if you tested negative with that you had no drugs in your system, they weren't going to test you again the rest of the year, which is completely different than cycling. Cycling, they can test you at any time, anywhere, any place, 365 days a year. Even if you're not in competition, they can find you and test you. And they don't just do a regular P test. They're drawing blood, which is much more difficult to mask or to hide drug use. And all those cyclists still aren't getting caught. So how easy is it for a baseball player not to get caught if they're only getting tested once a year and it's just a P test?
It may have boiled down to Manny maybe not as smart as Bonds or Clemens was when it came to how to dodge the tests. Or you mentioned that he got caught towards the end of his career. Maybe there was some desperation as he saw himself losing it and headed out of the majors and losing his ability to hit a baseball that maybe brought him to that point.
As Red Sox fans, we had a phrase for that, and that was Manny being Manny.
Yep. So that fits in. Other voters who fell along in the same line, and again, I have problems with their decisions. Christina Carl, who said on hers that she had very tough decisions because she couldn't cut down to 10 players. She actually considered dropping Mariano Rivera. And she used the thought process that he was a slam dunk Hall of Famer who didn't need my vote to get in. But she wanted to guarantee other guys got votes. Well, one of those guys is Sammy Sosa, who even if, like I said, another guy with huge steroid clouds around him. And pretty much we can say that's a guy that used steroids. I'm a White Sox fan. I saw him when he was coming up, and you've seen me. None of the people on the podcast, almost no one on this who's listening to this has seen me in person, but I'm skinny as a rail, right? And Sammy Sosa was about my size when he came up. And that nothing like the Hulk he was when he was playing for the Cubs and hitting all those home runs. How many home runs did Sosa end up with lifetime?
609. And by the way, I just wanted to point on his baseball reference page, he is listed as 6'165".
Is that current?
I don't know. It's just not even.
Is that a joke?
There's no way he's.
Is that his upper torso?
It's his head.
So, but I think so. But there you go. There's another voter who votes for a bunch of people, and Sosa included. She wanted to vote for, who were clearly steroid people. But again, you're leaving off Manny. But you're saying that you would have wanted to put because she left off Manny, but she wanted to put Sheffield on. But Manny was better. So again, I don't see the consistency here. You're either okay with the steroid use and you say, and this comment will be heard by somebody we both know who is a very big believer that, you know what, everybody was using. And his comment was that people were using greenies and amphetamines back in the 50s and 60s and painkillers in the 70s, and that someone's always been on something to help their performance. And that's his take on it. And you know what? I can respect that if that's going to be your take, that you don't care, that none of this is relevant, but at least be consistent about it. Be consistent. If you're going to vote for Clemens and Bonds, then you need to put Manny Ramirez on your ballot. Don't leave him off. Did you vote for Rafael Palmeiro when he was on the ballot? Because it's the same thing. He's got the numbers. He failed his test. But you know what? Who cares? Bonds didn't fail a test, but he used. Clemens didn't fail a test, but he used. And we talked about it beforehand, the idea of being judged. Your career is being judged. It's almost like a trial. Well, in our criminal justice system, it's sent to a jury with the instructions. If you find them guilty, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. It doesn't have to be 100%. You don't need complete 100% evidence that says this is what happened. You can use circumstantial evidence. You can have a preponderance of circumstantial evidence. There's very rarely in big crime cases that go to trial where you have an eyewitness or a smoking gun, as they say. Almost always it's a case built on a bunch of circumstantial things that build up over time where it's like, yeah, that guy did it. It's the same thing here. Clemens and Bonds and Sosa to some extent, all three of these guys, they didn't fail tests, but the evidence is there. They did this. So if you don't have a problem with it, if you're putting a couple of them on there, you need to put the other ones on there. Manny belongs on there if that's the case. Tim Kirkjian left Manny off as well. But he, again, voted for Bonds and Clemens and Sheffield. So this is the same problem with all these voters. Ian O'Connor, another guy, he voted for Bonds and Clemens, didn't put Manny on his roster. And unlike Christina Carl, who at least said that she thought there were more than 10 players, he only voted for 9. So he actually had a blank spot. So he could have put Manny on there. Again, consistency. Just be consistent. If you're okay with the steroid use, if you don't think it mattered, or you don't want to choose to try to figure out who did or who didn't, or when they did or when they didn't, then just look at the numbers and vote on that. But don't start picking and choosing. But this isn't even the worst. This isn't even the dumbest. The two dumbest things I saw was somebody by the name of Nick Pertrick. I'm going to call him Nicky P, because I can't pronounce his last name. He needs to do a reverse Wheel of Fortune and needs to get rid of a couple vowels and consonants. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I'm not even going to attempt to butcher it here. But he writes for ESPN. His exact comment was, listen, I know Sammy Sosa and Manny Ramirez are the most unpopular check marks on my ballot, along with Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens. So he voted for all 4 of them. And I at least will give him credit for that. His comment, I get it. But until being caught cheating, which Ramirez was twice, makes you ineligible for induction, I'm basing my picks solely on the numbers. Well, there's a lot of things that aren't on there as far as it goes, and we mentioned Schilling earlier and controversial views. There's lots of things a player can do that isn't in the actual terms of what constitutes a Hall of Fame player when you vote, when they instruct for how you're supposed to vote. It's ridiculous to say, well, that absolutely sounds like the excuse. Well, I don't see it exactly. Show me exactly where it says that. I can only imagine this guy would have been a good lawyer. Show me where it says that exactly. Where in the wording is that? It doesn't? Okay. Case dismissed. I just don't understand that. But then again, is he campaigning for Pete Rose to get in the Hall of Fame? Is there actually something that says, and I believe this was the case when the Rose controversy came up, is there anything that actually says being banned by the Major League Baseball Commissioner's office from the game makes you ineligible? Or did they add that after Rose?
I'm not 100%. I couldn't be 100% sure about that. I know that if you're not in good standing with Major League Baseball, you cannot be elected into the Hall of Fame. You're not even on the ballot. It's not even that you can't be voted. They just don't put you on the ballot.
He was never on the ballot.
Correct.
But that's something that they literally, I think, had to add after he was banned by the commissioner.
They can do whatever they want. It's their Hall of Fame. They can change the rules. It's up to them. Yeah.
Is Nikki P advocating for Rose to get put in? I mean, because that's one of the arguments I've always heard about Bonds or Clemens. It's like, well, how can you leave Barry Bonds out? He's the all-time leading home run guy. Well, Pete Rose is the all-time leading hit guy. He's not in the Hall of Fame because he broke one of the cardinal rules of the sport. He bet on the baseball. He bet on the games. Doesn't matter if he bet it to win,
he bet on the games he was in
and managed. Yes. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. But again, like I said, I got aggravated at his voting because that was, to me, was a weak excuse. Well, it's not exactly in there. Well, make a stand, dude. They either come out and say, I don't care. Again, the mutual friend we have that talks about why Bonds should be in would say he doesn't care because they all were doing it. At least that's consistent. I may not agree with it, but I can respect it because I would imagine if he had a ballot, he would have voted for Manny Ramirez. He would have put him on there and said the same thing. Yeah, he took drugs. So did everyone else. Finally, the last guy I'm going to talk about, and this guy really doesn't deserve a vote, not for making a vote for, because you're going to talk about some people who got votes, who the hell knows what these voters were thinking about when they voted for these guys, if we even know who some of these voters were. But this is a guy who voted for a candidate who isn't the worst candidate. And I could, if you voted for him and you said you voted for him, I wouldn't say it was a terrible vote. But his logic was absolutely ridiculous and terrible. Enrique Rojas voted for Omar Vizquel. And again, not the worst candidate in the world. This is what he said, though. When Omar Vizquel's Hall of Fame candidacy is discussed, journalists and fans alike use Ozzie Smith as a comparison, which is not really fair. Well, actually, it kind of is, because Ozzie may have been a better defender. Actually, Vizquel was really, really good defensively, too. Maybe as good as Ozzie. He may not have been as spectacular with some of his plays, but he was arguably the best fielding shortstop that we saw during our generation, other than Ozzie. And he was a better hitter in many ways. So I think that's actually a very good comp. But this is what Enrique Rojas says. Did you know there are 24 players in Cooperstown who spent the bulk of their careers as shortstops, and not all of them defended like Smith or hit like Honus Wagner and Cal Ripken? Have you read about Dave Bancroft, Joe Tinker, Rabbit Moranville, and Travis Jackson? Well, they are all shortstops who are in Cooperstown. That's his reasoning? Using the lowest common denominator, and that's what you're going to base your vote on? Does he even realize? Well, he does, obviously, but Rabbit Moranville and Joe Tinker are arguably two of the very worst players that are currently in the Hall of Fame. They have no business being in the Hall of Fame. They're terrible. They were not terrible players, but they were nowhere near Hall of Fame caliber players. Joe Tinker is in the Hall of Fame simply because some beat writer for the Cubs wrote a poem about him. Tinkers to Evers to Chance. And literally, that's what got him in the Hall of Fame. I would love to pull up. In fact, I will pull up. I'm going to pull up.
I already did.
Do you have Joe Tinker's
I have it
numbers
in front of me. Would you like me to share with you?
Tell me about Joe Tinker's amazing career.
Well, Joe Tinker's amazing career has one black number, and that was because he played 157 games in 1908. That's his only black number.
He showed up.
He showed up every day. He is a career 262 batting average, a career 308 on base percentage. He has 31 career home runs. Now, it was the dead ball era. I got that. 785 RBIs, 774 runs. That's it. You know what I find funny? You were just mentioning Rabbit Moranville. They list on Baseball Reference
by ages, yes.
And it's literally for like 10 years of his career, he and Rabbit Moranville were basically the same player. And neither of them are anywhere close to being a Hall of Famer. Some of their similarity scores include guys like Ozzie Guillen, Alfredo Griffin, Phil Rizzuto, another guy who doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame, right?
Who got in based on the fact that he played for all those Yankee championship teams. And again, Phil Rizzuto, a really nice guy, a Yankee legend, but not a Hall of Fame player based on what he actually did on the field. No, absolutely not. And that's the only one. Who else is on that? Look at that list. Joe Quinn. Is that the Mighty Quinn? Alfredo Griffin. So Germany Smith. Who the hell is Germany Smith? Did they name the country after him because he was so good? Roger Peckinpah. Didn't he direct the Wild Bunch? Is that who that was?
Germany Smith didn't even play in the 20th century. He only played in the 19th century. He played for the Brooklyn Grays and the Cincinnati Reds and had a very short career. Again, 47 home runs, 800 RBIs, 907 runs, 243 batting average. 243.
These are the guys he's comped on. So I'm just going to end it by saying Enrique Rojas is if he's using his logic to vote for Vizquel, make the case for Vizquel, make a case for him to be in the Hall of Fame. And I may agree with it. I may disagree with it, but don't sit there and talk about, well, there's all these crappy players in the Hall of Fame and he's better than them, so he should be in. That's a terrible argument. It's a lazy argument. It's an idiotic argument. My God, let's hope he doesn't end up on the Veterans Committee, because then he's going to want to put in another 1,000 guys, because there are plenty of players. It's not just Tinker. It's not just Moranville or Travis Jackson or Bancroft. We can look at a lot of positions, and we just talked about Harold Baines being one of those that maybe shouldn't have been in there either. And you said that the current voters don't use the Veteran Committee selections necessarily as a base mark to say, well, so-and-so got in, so I need to vote for this other player. Well, apparently Enrique Rojas uses the worst players in the Hall of Fame and figures out who they're better than on the ballot, and they'll eliminate them. But if you can beat out the worst of the worst, then I guess you get a Hall of Fame ticket punched, at least on Enrique's ballot. Again, it's not the player. It's not that I don't think Omar Vizquel is a good candidate, but that's ridiculously bad logic. How do you get it? The whole idea we've heard about sabermetrics and get, like you said, getting rid of the curmudgeons was that we were going to get rid of people who didn't know what the hell they were doing. And yet here's a guy with a vote who comes out and basically says, this is how I came to my decision. And it's, like I said, it's terrible logic. It's indefensible. He could try to defend it. It's still stupid. It doesn't make any sense. But then again, what did all these people have in common? Similarity scores. They all write for ESPN, which again is not exactly the crowning achievement in sports journalism anymore. But then again, as you pointed out, there were other people who got votes. Why don't you share with our audience some of the other luminaries who got votes in this election?
Sure. Before I do that, let me make one argument against what you're saying, against the argument of, if you voted for Clemens and Bonds, why didn't you vote for Ramirez? And I'm going to give you the one legitimate argument of why you would do that. I think with both Clemens and Bonds, they weren't taking steroids their whole career. I think it's pretty apparent when you look at their career trajectories that you can almost pick out the exact moment at which they started using. And the thing is that their careers prior to that were Hall of Fame worthy. And if you just take their normal trajectory of what they did prior to that, they were probably Hall of Famers prior to using. Using obviously made them better and increased their numbers, but Barry Bonds was one of the best players in baseball, period. Roger Clemens was one of the best pitchers in baseball, period, prior to them using drugs. I'm not sure with Manny Ramirez that you can point to a time when he was or wasn't taking drugs. It just kind of all looks the same. And Manny did test positive. So you know, and we don't know where that started. So that's probably the only argument that I can justify. My feeling is, and I've said this numerous times, I think the overwhelming majority of players in that era, and maybe right up through now, are using something because they can get away with it, because in their mind, it gives them the edge. And their argument always is, whether it was a track and field star, whether it was Lance Armstrong, anyone, their defense almost always is exactly the same. I was doing it because everyone else was, and I just was leveling the playing field. I don't know that you can make the argument now that there aren't guys already in the Hall of Fame who are using drugs, whether it be, and again, I'm not pointing fingers. I'm not saying I believe this. I'm just saying that it has been brought up in other places. There was questions about Mike Piazza. There were questions about Bagwell. Well, they're both in the Hall of Fame. And if you let players who probably were using, then you have to let them all in. And you can't make those distinctions of, well, this guy tested positive, this one didn't, but we're pretty sure he took it. But because he didn't test positive, we're going to vote him in. I don't know what you can do.
And I actually agree with you on that. I and that's my problem is that the ESPN guys that I pointed out and Lady, to me, weren't even being consistent though with their own internal logic. But what you're saying, I don't have a problem with that, even if I don't agree with it. And I think you make a great point about Bonds and Clemens. Really, there's really a defining point where you can kind of look at their career numbers and the way their career was going and say that's when it started. And you know what? Like you said, both of them were headed, if they had not taken steroids, if they had not done this, they probably would have seen a career progression that still would have probably landed them in the Hall of Fame. So if that's your reasoning for putting them, that actually would make sense. Even if I didn't necessarily agree with it, and I'm not saying I do or I don't, but that would actually, you know what, that's a very good, compelling argument. And again, the other argument, like you said, you can't make the distinction because maybe there already are people in there. And you mentioned a couple names who had clouds around them who are in. If that's the case, if that's what you believe, and you say it doesn't matter if you did or didn't, they were all doing it. Now, I personally hate the argument everyone was doing it because I always feel like that's something a 5-year-old says.
I'm not saying it's a good argument.
Oh, no. And I'm not saying you are. But, you know, Frank Thomas is a guy who tirelessly over his career campaigned against steroid usage. He was just a naturally big guy and a naturally gifted athlete. He was a freakish athlete. He was one of the White Sox players who helped lead. One of the things that brought about testing was when a certain number of people failed tests that they did. And by refusing to take the test, that was marked as a failure. And a large number of White Sox players, largely led by Frank Thomas, refused to take the test and that helped trigger the testing that did end up getting into Major League Baseball as part of their collective bargaining agreement. So Thomas was very much against steroid use. So not everybody did it. But you're right. There are plenty of people that are probably still using now. And because you're right, they can't catch them because they're going to stay one step ahead. And if your argument is, well, we're never going to figure this out, all we can go by is the numbers, and I don't want to try to even think about figuring it out, then that's fine. But then make that the case. When A-Rod shows up on the ballot in a couple years, you need to vote him in. His numbers support it. And he won't be the only one.
And just to be clear, prior to the point at which we think that Clemens used steroids, he had 3 Cy Young Awards. Prior to the time that we think that Barry Bonds started using, he had 3 MVPs. Now, Clemens had another 3 or 4 Cy Youngs after that, and Barry Bonds had 4 straight MVPs after he was definitely taking.
But like you said, prior to that, Hall of Fame worthy.
Yes.
And headed towards that path. Which honestly, and this is the last point I want to make about the steroid usage, and you said it best before the podcast. The one thing is that they can't erase by doing what they did, or what we think they did, or what we're pretty sure they did, is the stigma of it. That no matter what, Roger Clemens is always going to have that cloud over his head, whether he gets in the Hall of Fame or not. So he may get the plaque. He may get the induction ceremony. I've said that if Bonds and Clemens get elected, or if Manny were to get elected, if any of the steroid guys get in, you're going to see a boycott by a number of players who just won't show up for the induction ceremony out of protest. And, you know, that'll be a public relations black eye for baseball if it happens. We'll have to wait and see if that is what happens. If it turns out that any of these guys do get in, just be consistent. But there are other players who got votes who you can't make these arguments for. And you made up a little list here of a couple guys, and we can kind of talk about them to close it out. Some strange voters making some strange voting decisions, such as
Michael Young, who was a very nice, solid baseball player for a number of years. But at no point did I ever watch him and say, wow, he has Hall of Fame feel about him. Even for 1 year did I ever feel that. 9 votes. 9 out of, now it's not that many, 9 out of 425, but it's probably 9 too many. Lance Berkman, again, a very nice, good hitter, probably better than Michael Young, to be honest with you. 5 votes. Miguel Tejada, 5 votes. Again, not a guy who ever felt like a Hall of Famer. Roy Oswalt, 4 votes. Not a Hall of Famer. And I'm even going to get to how ridiculous some of the votes were on Oswalt in a moment. Placido Polanco, 2 votes.
Was that the singer in The Naked Gun?
No, that was Enrico Palazzo, but close.
Ah, okay. All right.
You know what Placido Polanco was? Wasn't he a guy, I mean, from a fantasy perspective, wasn't he a guy you like bid? You're like, you're at the end, you're like, you need to fill out a middle infielder and you got a handful of dollars left. It's like you throw a $1 bid in Placido Polanco and hope you get him.
Yeah. Yeah. I will say, other than Polanco, you named 4 players who were really, really good players. And this is meant as more play. Michael Young was a career 300 hitter. He had 2,300 hits. He had a bunch of 200 hit seasons. Berkman was an MVP candidate. It was a very feared power hitter and hit for a good average and was just a dangerous hitter in that Houston lineup. Miguel Tejada was, again, a very, very dangerous hitter for a good chunk of his career and won an MVP award and again, had relatively good numbers, 300 home runs and 2,400 hits, 285 lifetime hitter. These are really good players, but like you said, there's the talk about there's the Hall of the really, really good, and then there's the Hall of Fame, and there's that level where you kind of separate, and none of those guys feel like Hall of Famers. Roy Oswalt's another guy that you mentioned, and the numbers just aren't there. He started his career so strongly. You know, if you looked at him through his first 5 seasons, you would have said he was headed to the Hall of Fame. He had come off of a second 20-win season. He was 83-39 with slightly better than just above a 3 ERA, 3.07. You know, he was age 27. That was 5 seasons in the majors. And you would have said that's a guy that's going to go to the Hall of Fame. He ended up with 163 wins. He ended up with a .615 winning percentage, which is good, but we talked about like Halliday's earlier. It's not as good as Halliday's. He failed to strike out 2,000 batters. He never won a Cy Young. You know, from 2006 through 2008, Oswalt was still solid. But from age 31, which was his 2009 season, to the end of his career, and he retired, he only pitched until he was 35. He ended in Colorado abysmally. He went 34-38 with a ERA close to 4 from 2009 to 2013, a point in time where we started to see pitching make a little bit of a rebound. So, you know, he really fell off the cliff quickly, but he was really good, right? We watched Roy Oswalt pitch for a number of years, a really good pitcher, but not, like you said, not a Hall of Famer. Polanco, I don't even want to know what possessed somebody to vote for Placido Polanco. Unless they liked the Naked Gun movies and they got confused. Maybe that was it.
And neither of the people, I don't know if it's guys, it could have been women, don't know, but both ballots were not made public. So we don't know who those 2 people are.
I'm not surprised. I wouldn't want to make that ballot public.
Then don't make the vote. If you can't defend it, then don't make the vote.
Because that's the thing. You can't defend it. There's no way you could defend that.
Here's the thing. If, let's say, whoever that put him on the ballot, maybe that person did vote for 10 people. There were 10 other people that were far better candidates than Placido Polanco. It's not even close. But anyway, let me also continue so we can wrap this up. We talked about Oswalt getting 4 votes. One of the votes came from Rene Cardenas, who, in addition to voting for Oswalt and Berkman and Clemens and Wagner, what's the common thread there? He's a writer in Houston, shockingly enough. He didn't vote for Mike Messina, but he voted for Roy Oswalt. Roy Oswalt couldn't hold Mike Messina's jockstrap. It isn't even close. And I'm not the biggest Mike Messina fan, but Mike Messina was far greater than Roy Oswalt at any time in his career.
His career, yes, he was. Yeah, that's and we talked about when you name the players he voted for. I think that was the first question out of my mouth. Is like, is this like a Houston beat writer?
It was,
and you said apparently yes. So again, that right there, this guy should not have a ballot. That right there, you can't defend that. Take that guy's ballot away. He shouldn't be voting for, I have a dog downstairs. I should just throw names out onto the floor and just see where my dog takes a leak on and just say, and come up with a voting pattern that's better than what Rene Cardenas did.
Another voter, Jose de Jesus Ortiz, voted for Oswalt, but did not vote for Schilling or Walker. But let's compare Oswalt to Schilling. Not even a comparison. It's not even close. Marcos Breton voted for Miguel Tejada, but not Schilling or Walker. Gary Brown voted for Tejada, Bonds, and Clemens and Manny. So he went the full Monty on the steroid guys, but didn't vote for Larry Walker. David Lennon had one of the more weird ballots that I saw, in that last year he voted for Edgar Martinez, Mike Messina, and Curt Schilling, and this year he dropped all three of them and voted for other players.
Well, to be fair, all three of them didn't really have much production this past season.
That's a good point, which reminds me that there was a tweet by Jason Collette today where he showed, I don't know if you noticed on Twitter, there's this whole thing going on with a 10-year challenge. It's basically show a picture of yourself 10 years ago and show a picture of you today and show how you've aged. And so it's been a whole, thing going on. And he posted Edgar Martinez's stats from 10 years ago and his stats from today. And by the way, they're exactly the same. They haven't
exactly
changed.
The same. Yep.
His stats have not changed in 10 years. It was a great tweet. Kind of showed the stupidity of this whole Hall of Fame election process. John Heyman voted for Bonds, but not Clemens. He voted for Berkman, Scott Rowland, and Andrew Jones, who was, again, another very good player, one of the great defensive outfielders, but not a Hall of Famer. And he didn't vote for Larry Walker.
The inexcusable part about that is you're voting for Bonds, but you're not voting for Clemens. How do you rationale that? How do you rationale? Because now you have two guys, neither of which failed the test. How can you sit there and say, I'm going to vote for Bonds, but I think, how can you exclude Clemens at that point? That's ridiculous. This is a major, John Heyman isn't a nobody. This is a big time baseball writer. And I want to hear the logic behind that. How do you come up with that? I'm just beside myself. That's just utter stupidity.
Yep. Dan Shaughnessy of the Boston Globe had one of the more interesting ballots. He voted for one player and one player only. And obviously, since we know that Mariano was unanimous, he voted for Mariano. In his article, he stated that there was only one player that he felt was relevant or deserving of being in the Hall of Fame, and he thought it was Mariano. It's a very pure ballot. A couple of voters, Paul Doherty and Stephen Marcus, just voted for two players. They both voted for Mariano. Doherty voted for Halladay. Stephen Marcus voted for Edgar Martinez as his second person. And Evan Grant did write a story about why he voted for Michael Young. I didn't read it. Let me take that back. Let me step that back 1 second. I read the first two lines of the article and then was like, nope, I'm out. And he basically admitted that he was the one person who voted for Michael Young for MVP 7 years ago. And at no point was Michael Young ever an MVP. He may have been the best player on his team, but there's no way that he was the MVP that year. So the minute I got to the second line, I was just like, nope, I'm out. Done. Nothing more to see here. So
nothing to see.
So we do have that backlog of players, and there were a lot of people saying that, yeah, there's a lot of players that, they had trouble getting it down to 10. Well, starting next year, we're going through a period in which there's not a lot of really good players that feel like Hall of Famers that are going to be coming up on the ballot. Next year, the best player we mentioned earlier is probably Derek Jeter. Some of the other ones that are on there are Josh Beckett, Bobby Abreu, Eric Chavez, Adam Dunn, Rafael Furcal, Jason Giambi, Paul Konerko, Cliff Lee, Alfonso Soriano. All of them very good players. None of them really feel like Hall of Famers.
Maybe Soriano?
Maybe. Did Soriano have a drug suspension? No, he didn't. No, I'm thinking of Cannone.
But at the same time, it doesn't matter if he did, because I would assume the perception would be that, he played in the era. And if everyone was using, he probably was as well. He was a middle infielder who was hitting 30 to 40 home runs a season, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. In 2021, there's really, looking at this list, I'm not sure I see any Hall of Famers. Mark Burley, A.J. Burnett, Michael Kadire, Dan Herron, Tim Hudson, Torrey Hunter, Adam LaRoche, Aramis Ramirez, Alex Rios, Nick Swisher, Dan Ugla, Shane Victorino, and Barry Zito. Do you see any Hall of Famers there?
I do not.
That seems like a really weak class. Again, all really good players. I've owned many of them on fantasy baseball teams. They were great pieces and parts, but none of them ever felt like a Hall of Famer. Going to 2022, it gets a little bit more interesting. There are two biggies that are going to be a good litmus test to see what happens with some of these steroid players, so to speak. You have David Ortiz, but more importantly, you have Alex Rodriguez. So there's a guy who we know tested positive, had some tremendous numbers. But again, when did he start taking? So probably when he was with the Rangers, and he had a really good start to his career when he was with the Mariners. So the question is, are people going to overlook that? Others in 2022 include Carl Crawford, Prince Fielder, Ryan Howard, Joe Nathan, Jonathan Papelbon, Jake Peavy, AJ Pierzynski, Jimmy Rollins, and Mark Teixeira. Again, a lot of really good players there. Not with the exception of Ortiz and A-Rod, none of them are Hall of Fame worthy.
Maybe when we look deeper, maybe we're going to find a Mike Messina or an Edgar Martinez or someone that we say, you know what, after closer examination, this guy is a Hall of Famer. But you're right, none of them are jumping out at this point, other than the obvious choices you mentioned.
Yeah. It actually gets worse in 2023 and 2024. You've got Carlos Beltran, Andre Ethier, John Lackey, Johnny Peralta, Francisco Rodriguez, Houston Street, Jared Weaver, and Jason Worth. None of those really feel like Hall of Famers to me. 2024, you have somebody. Adrian Beltre is probably a Hall of Famer.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
I absolutely think.
I don't know if he's a first ballot Hall of Famer, but he's a Hall of Famer. Also in 2024, you have Victor Martinez, Joe Mauer, Chase Utley, David Wright, and Brad Ziegler. I don't know why Brad Ziegler is not even on that list, but whatever. David Wright, a very good player, but the injuries just killed his career. Chase Utley, had a really nice 5-year stretch in there, but not much of anything. Joe Mauer he did have one MVP, but not much else. Victor Martinez, again, a very good player, but didn't really feel like a Hall of Famer. So that's what you have coming up. So you have a lot of years in there where you might not get any of the first ballot guys getting elected. So that will free up some of this backlog, and it may help somebody like Larry Walker, especially next year, when I think Larry Walker's last year, right?
Yeah, we said that was going to be his last year. I think it's going to help Schilling. Yes. I think that's going to be the main guy. Jeff Kent might get a boost, though his totals are just really low right now. So he would have to make a major jump. And that might be it. Scott Rowland's another guy who probably will get a closer look and a better look. Third base has been traditionally underrepresented in the Hall of Fame, and it's a very difficult position to play well defensively and put up good offensive numbers. But we'll wait and see what happens with this. We'll be having this discussion hopefully next year. Maybe with a little less controversy, or maybe with a little bit more. We'll have to wait and see how it pans out. So on that note, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Steve, if you want to take us out, I think that should do it for tonight.
Sure. I'd like to thank you all for listening. We'll be back later this week. I'm not sure what we'll be doing next, whether we'll be looking at maybe some of the upcoming movies. I know we were chatting about the idea that doing a January through June window of movie releases. We'll also be coming back at you with an update on Major League Baseball free agency. There was a little bit of movement today. I started seeing some guys getting signed. Not any of the big pieces, but some of the smaller pieces, finding locations and jobs for the year. And so we will catch you on the other side.
Thank you for listening to the Excruciating Minutiae Podcast. Check us out at excruciatingpodcast.com. Please subscribe to our podcast on any of your favorite podcast platforms and follow us on Twitter at excruciatingpod. See you at the next episode.